Hello. So in this episode of Writing Notes, we're going to talk about distinguishing between an informative source and an argumentative source. So this is, in a way, primarily focused on the type of things we find in news or magazine articles. So, Americans are quite bad, as it turns out, at distinguishing between fact and opinion. And the Pew Research actually did a survey on this a few years ago. And what they did was they came up with 10 statements pulled from the headlines. 5 of them were fact-based statements, 5 of them were opinion-based statements. And I'm going to put an image of those statements up on the screen right now, and I'll give you a few seconds to look over them. I'll also put a link down below to the actual Pew Research study, so you can go. I think they still have they're not doing the study anymore, but I think they still have the quiz option up, so you can go through and try and identify which of these statements are facts and which of these statements are opinions. And then at the end, it will tell you which broad range you fell into in terms of how many you got correct and how many you got incorrect. So, Americans, as it turns out, as I said, are quite bad at distinguishing between fact and opinion. There are even those who argue that we live in a post-fact or a post-truth era. And this, of course, has been helped along by both the proliferation of actual fake news, conspiracy theories and things like this, but also by the rejection of true information, the rejection of facts under the heading of fake news. So, one problem that a lot of Americans have, as the Pew Research study found out, is that if you agree with something, you're more likely to believe it's a fact, even if it's an opinion, whereas when you disagree with something, you're more likely to identify it as an opinion, even if it's a fact. So, how do we tell the difference? Well, the quick and dirty sort of distinction between a fact and an opinion is that a fact is something that is objectively measurable in the world, whereas an opinion is something that is not objectively measurable. So, for instance, when I'm making at the moment that I'm making this video, over 150,000 Americans have died of COVID-19, the novel coronavirus. Over 150,000. That is a fact. Whether you agree with it or not, whether you like it or not, and there's a lot to not like about that number, but that is a fact because it's something that can be objectively measured about the world. That's something that hospitals, doctors, the CDC, whatever it is, has compiled the data on, and they have measured that number, making that a fact. On the other hand, a statement like the reason so many Americans have died of COVID-19 is because the Trump administration was not effective enough at responding to the pandemic. That is an opinion. That can't be objectively measured. You could produce evidence to support that, you could produce evidence to refute that, you could develop arguments for and against that, but it's not something concrete. There's no specific measurement you could apply to, that would allow you to say this is objectively accurate. So again, this is not a question of can you make a good argument for it, it's a question of does it exist in the world? and is it measurable in the world? So that's one key thing that we're thinking about when we're distinguishing between an argumentative text and an informative text. An informative news article especially is going to tell us, here is a thing in the world. So this can be quite tricky because a lot of times we get news articles that present people's opinions, but the news article itself is simply informing us that that person has that opinion. So, Donald Trump tweeted X thing. He tweeted X argument about the unreliability of mail-in voting. Trump is making an argument there. Trump is presenting an opinion. He is taking an argument. He's making an argument. But the news article that says Trump tweeted X thing, that's an informative source. So we want to be aware of that distinction, especially if we're doing something like a rhetorical analysis project. If you have an article that's informing you that someone made an argument or is informing you that something occurred, there's not that much there in terms of rhetoric to work with. On the other hand, we have argumentative sources, things that are giving opinions or things that are making claims in and of themselves. So if on the one hand I have a news article that's saying Trump tweeted that mail-in voting will lead to massive voter fraud, this is a thing that he said, that's an informative article. If I then have another article saying Trump tweeted this, but he's wrong because there's no evidence of substantial voter fraud in any of the mail-in voting systems currently in the US. That's an argument. So that's not an objectively measurable thing. Over here, in the news article, we've got a fact. Trump said this. We can go to his Twitter account, we can look at the tweet, we can objectively assess that it's occurred in the world. On the other hand, the question of whether or not he's right is an opinion. It's something that one would have to make an argument to support. Now, conceptually, if you wanted to say, no, he didn't actually tweet that, Twitter doesn't exist, whatever it is, you could, in principle, argue against a fact, but generally, if it exists, Twitter is there, it's hard to make a reasonable argument that that doesn't exist. So, especially, again, in terms of doing something like a rhetorical analysis, you want to find an article that's making a claim, that's making a value judgment, or that's presenting an opinion. So you could look for op-eds in newspapers, you could look for maybe feature articles, you could look for things like this. And again, what you're trying to assess in distinguishing argumentative, since I'm putting argument over here in my hand gestures, in distinguishing argumentative from informative is whether this is presenting an opinion, whether this is presenting an argument, a value judgment, or something like this that needs to be debated, that needs to be supported with evidence, or whether it's presenting a fact. If it's something that can be objectively measured in the world or objectively seen in the world, it's a fact. And if it's a fact, it's informative. If it's an opinion, it's argumentative. So this is the key distinction between these two types of articles.